Intercepted Hearts. A Small Town Enemies to Lovers Football Romance. By Win Valentine. First edition published by I2I Hype, LLC 2025. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Chapter 1: Arrival in Chaos. Lila Carson loved quiet mornings at Salty Waves. The gentle whoosh of waves, the occasional tinkle of the door chime, and the scratch of her pencil as she sketched new designs for the shop's summer merchandise line, pure bliss. But on this particular Tuesday morning, a commotion outside shattered her peace like a badly timed wipeout. "Is that?" One of her regular customers, Mrs. Henderson, pressed her face against the front window, her silver-rimmed glasses fogging up the glass. "Oh my goodness, there must be a dozen photographers out there." Lila set down her pencil with a frown, her latest design for a line of beach totes forgotten. The usual mix of surfers and tourists on the boardwalk had transformed into a swarm of cameras and shouting voices, their excited chatter audible even through the shop's walls. Before she could investigate further, her shop's door flew open with a violent jingle of bells, and in strode 6 feet 2 inches of pure trouble. Even if she hadn't seen him plastered across every sports magazine and gossip site from Miami to Seattle, there was no mistaking Chase Dalton. He wore board shorts and a fitted gray t-shirt that probably cost more than her weekly profits. His dark hair artfully disheveled like he'd just stepped off a photo shoot rather than running from one. Those piercing green eyes darted around her shop, taking in the surfboards and beachy decor with obvious interest. The way he carried himself, confident but slightly on edge, reminded her of the celebrities who sometimes wandered into her shop during the summer tourist season, except there was something more authentic in his stance, despite his obvious discomfort. Something that made her pulse quicken in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "Mind if I hide out here for a minute?" He flashed her what she assumed was his signature smile, the one that had launched 1,000 tabloid headlines and melted countless hearts across America. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a hint of genuine plea beneath the practiced charm. "I seem to have picked up a few admirers." "You mean the paparazzi circus that's currently blocking my storefront?" Lila crossed her arms, unimpressed by the charm offensive, though her heart betrayed her with an annoying flutter. The last thing she needed was her peaceful morning interrupted by a media frenzy. "Those admirers?" Chase's smile faltered slightly, like he wasn't used to it failing to have the desired effect. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face, making him look younger, more real than his polished public persona. "I'm Chase Dalton." "Yeah, I know." She glanced outside where the photographers were still hovering, their cameras raised like weapons, jostling each other for the best angle through her storefront windows. "You're kind of hard to miss." Her phone buzzed in her back pocket, Drew's familiar contact photo lighting up the screen, his goofy grin from their last beach day mocking her current situation. "Speaking of hard to miss," she answered with a sigh, already knowing what was coming. Her brother's timing was as predictable as the tide, and about as subtle as a hurricane. "Tell me you haven't seen him yet," Drew said without preamble. "If by him you mean the walking media magnet, currently using my shop as a hideout? Little late for warnings, big brother. Lila turned away from Chase, lowering her voice and moving behind the counter to create some distance, her fingers absently tracing the weathered wood she'd sanded herself when she first opened the store. What's he doing in Oceanview anyway? Coach brought him in to cover for Ethan while his shoulder heals. It's temporary. Drew's tone carried all the enthusiasm of someone announcing a root canal. Just be careful around him, Lila. His reputation is none of my business, she cut him off, feeling that familiar spark of irritation at Drew's overprotectiveness flare up like a summer bonfire. And neither is yours, remember? I'm a big girl, Drew. More customers filtered in, drawn by the commotion outside like seagulls to scattered chips. The usual morning crowd of surfers and beachgoers had been replaced by curious locals, all pretending to browse while stealing glances at Chase. The peaceful sanctuary of her shop, usually filled with the gentle sound of ocean waves and lazy conversation, was quickly turning into a spectator sport. Did you see the article about him and that reality TV star? One teenage girl whispered none too quietly to her friend, practically bouncing on her toes as she clutched a turquoise bikini she clearly had no intention of buying. And now he's playing for the Sharks. Mom says ticket sales are already going crazy. Do you think he'll sign autographs? Lila pinched the bridge of her nose, feeling a headache brewing behind her eyes like an approaching storm. Oceanview was a small town with an even smaller gossip mill, where news traveled faster than a riptide. Chase Dalton's presence would be like throwing chum in shark-infested waters, and somehow she had a feeling her quiet little surf shop had just become ground zero for the feeding frenzy. So much for her peaceful morning inventory count. The door chimed again, and Ethan Cole walked in, his right arm still in a sling but his smile as warm as ever. He carried a stack of flyers in his good hand, the paper edges slightly crumpled from being tucked against his chest. The sight of him made Lila's heart ache. He'd always been one of the good ones, steady and reliable as the tides. She'd watched him lead the Sharks through countless victories, his calm presence a cornerstone of the team's success. Morning, Lila. Mind if I leave some of these for the youth league? He noticed Chase and nodded. Dalton? Getting to know the local spots? There was no judgment in his tone, just genuine curiosity. That was Ethan, always making others feel welcome, even when he was dealing with his own struggles. Trying to, Chase replied, and Lila noted how his celebrity swagger dimmed slightly in Ethan's presence. Interesting. The way his shoulders hunched ever so slightly reminded her of a student meeting his favorite teacher. She'd seen that look before, usually on rookie players meeting Ethan for the first time. How's the shoulder? Lila asked, taking the flyers from Ethan. The paper was warm from his grip, and she could see the Physical Therapy Center's logo at the top. She'd known him since high school, when he'd been the golden boy quarterback who never let it go to his head, and it hurt to see him sidelined. Her fingers traced the edge of the papers absently, as memories of Friday night games flooded back. Drew mentioned you're out for a while. Few more weeks at least. Ethan's expression tightened before he forced another smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling with effort. But hey, the team's in good hands. Chase here has one hell of an arm. When I can actually practice without being mobbed, Chase muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. His designer shirt looked rumpled now, a far cry from the polished image he'd presented walking in. Welcome to small-town life, Lila said dryly, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. The familiarity of Oceanview's gossip mill was both comforting and suffocating, like a favorite sweater that had shrunk in the wash. Where everyone knows your business before you do, and your coffee order becomes front-page news. Ethan chuckled, the sound rich and familiar like waves breaking on shore. She's not wrong. But the town'll settle down once the novelty wears off. He adjusted his sling with the slight wince that made Lila's fingers itch to help. She'd always had a protective streak when it came to her friends. I should head out. Got a physical therapy appointment. After Ethan left, Chase peered out the window like a man checking for circling sharks. Think it's safe? Depends on your definition of safe. Lila moved to straighten a display of surf wax that a group of rubbernecking teenagers had knocked askew, the coconut scent wafting up as she realigned the boxes. The sweet tropical aroma usually calmed her, but today it just reminded her of how much cleanup she'd have to do. But you might want to use the back door. It leads to the alley behind the shops. Just watch out for Mrs. Henderson's cat. She thinks she owns the place. Thanks? Chase hesitated, then added, his voice softening like the evening tide, sorry about all this. I know it's disruptive. Just try to keep the media circus away from my shop in the future, Lila said, gesturing at the scattered merchandise that would need reorganizing. Her morning inventory count was definitely shot. I have a business to run, and contrary to popular belief, chaos isn't good for sales. Chase nodded and headed for the back door. The moment he stepped outside, camera flashes exploded like lightning, transforming her usually peaceful alley into a paparazzi war zone. Lila caught snippets of their shouts through the door's weathered wood. Chase. Over here. Is this your new girlfriend? Are you dating a local? Lila's jaw dropped. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Her peaceful morning had just transformed into a tabloid headline, and somehow she knew this was only the beginning. She watched as Chase hurried down the alley, the paparazzi in hot pursuit, and felt a headache building behind her eyes. This was exactly the kind of drama she didn't need in her life. Oceanview was her sanctuary, her escape from the chaos of the wider world. Now that chaos had walked right through her door, bringing with it a tidal wave of complications that threatened to disrupt everything she'd worked so hard to build. Mrs. Henderson appeared at her elbow, clutching her ever-present crochet bag like it contained all the town's secrets. Well, dear, that was exciting. You know, my niece is single. Don't even think about it, Lila cut her off with a laugh that was only slightly strained. She'd known Mrs. Henderson long enough to recognize the beginning of one of her matchmaking schemes. I have enough on my plate without adding a tabloid magnate quarterback to the mix. But as she watched the last photographer disappear around the corner, camera still clicking away like rapid gunfire, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that Oceanview's peaceful days were numbered. Chase Dalton might be temporary, but something told her the ripples from his arrival would affect their little coastal town in ways none of them could predict. Drew was going to have a field day with this one. She picked up her abandoned sketch, where she'd been designing new surf-themed t-shirts for the summer collection. The half-finished wave patterns suddenly seemed too calm, too ordinary for what their town was becoming. Maybe she should add a shark being chased by paparazzi to the collection. At least then she could profit from the chaos. She could already picture it, Oceanview, where the sharks aren't just in the water. Chapter 2, Uneasy Alliances. Chase leaned back against his rental car's leather seat, watching the waves roll in through the windshield. Oceanview was exactly what he'd hoped for when he'd agreed to step in for Ethan Cole, a place where football still mattered, but maybe not quite as much as the tide schedule or the daily catch at the pier. The practice field came into view as he rounded the corner, its worn bleachers and salt-weathered goalposts a far cry from the pristine stadiums he was used to. The rusted chain-link fence and patchy grass would have horrified his former team's groundskeepers, but something about it made him smile. The simplicity, the raw authenticity, it reminded him of his early days, before endorsement deals and Sports Illustrated covers had complicated everything. That smile faded when he spotted Drew Carson waiting by the locker room entrance, arms crossed and jaw set. The quarterback coach's stance screamed confrontation, and Chase had dealt with enough hostile media to recognize the signs. The morning's tabloid photos must have already made their rounds through town, faster than he'd expected. Dalton, Drew called out as Chase approached. Got a minute? Chase had been expecting this conversation since the moment he'd spotted the paparazzi at the coffee shop. Sure thing, coach. He squared his shoulders, preparing for what was coming, the familiar weight of others' assumptions settling onto his back. Drew's expression hardened, his eyes as cold as the ocean during a winter storm. Let's get one thing straight. You're here because Ethan's shoulder needs time, and we need someone who can throw. That's it. I understand. And my sister? Drew continued, stepping closer, close enough that Chase could see the muscle ticking in his jaw and smell the mint from his morning coffee. She's off limits. I saw those photos from this morning. The last thing she needs is to get caught up in your media circus. Chase felt his own jaw tighten, fighting back the familiar frustration of being judged by headlines rather than truth. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. With all due respect, Coach, I didn't ask for those photographers to follow me. And your sister seems perfectly capable of making her own decisions. Just focus on the playbook, Drew said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. That's what you're here for. Before Chase could respond, Ethan appeared beside them, his presence immediately diffusing some of the tension. Even sidelined, the guy had a natural way of commanding respect, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. Chase caught the slight wince as Ethan shifted his injured shoulder, a reminder of why they were all in this situation to begin with. Drew, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying that natural authority that made everyone listen. Team meeting in 5. Drew gave Chase one last hard look before heading inside, his footsteps echoing against the concrete like a countdown. The tension in the air lingered even after he disappeared through the door. Ethan waited until Drew was out of earshot, adjusting his stance to take pressure off his injured side. Don't take it personally. He's protective of both the team and his sister. He gestured toward the beach, where waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm that reminded Chase of the heartbeat of his old stadium. Walk with me? They moved away from the locker room, and Chase felt his shoulders relax slightly, the ocean breeze cooling his heated skin. The salt air was different here, cleaner somehow, without the city's edge he'd grown accustomed to. Small towns take some getting used to, Ethan continued, his limp barely noticeable as they walked along the path. Everyone knows everyone's business. But they also look out for each other. Give it time. His words carried the weight of someone who'd lived that truth. I didn't come here looking for drama, Chase said, running a hand through his hair, feeling the familiar frustration build. I just needed a break from the spotlight? Ethan finished, understanding clear in his eyes. I get it. But you've got to understand, bringing the spotlight here affects everyone. It's not just your story anymore. Chase nodded, feeling the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome friend. The team needed him to fill Ethan's shoes, the town needed him to respect their way of life, and somewhere in between he needed to find his own peace. The roar of the waves seemed to mock the simplicity he'd been searching for when he chose Oceanview. I should probably make things right with Lila, Chase said, remembering the chaos that had erupted outside her shop that morning. Her shop didn't deserve that chaos this morning. Those photographers were relentless. He could still picture the frustration on her face as she tried to protect her customers from the media circus. Ethan's lips quirked, a knowing look crossing his weathered features. Probably. Just tread carefully. Lila Carson's got more spirit than half the team combined. And a mean right hook, or so I've heard. There was an amused glint in his eye that made Chase wonder about the story behind that particular piece of information. After practice, Chase found himself pulling up to salty waves again, his hands tight on the steering wheel as he debated whether this was the right move. The afternoon crowd had thinned, and thankfully no photographers lurked in sight, a small mercy he didn't take for granted anymore. Through the window, he could see Lila arranging a display of surfboards, her movements precise and focused, completely in her element. The sun caught her hair, turning it to spun gold, and for a moment he forgot why he'd been nervous about coming back. The bell chimed as he entered, and Lila looked up, her expression immediately guarded. The welcoming smile she usually wore for customers disappeared behind a mask of cool professionalism. Back so soon? She asked, crossing her arms. The stance was defensive, but Chase noticed she held her ground instead of backing away. I came to apologize, Chase said, keeping his distance. The scent of surf wax and ocean air filled the space between them. This morning was unfortunate. That's one word for it. I was thinking more along the lines of circus or complete disaster. I'd like to make it up to you. He gestured around the shop, taking in the carefully curated displays and local artwork. Let me help promote your business. The right way, not through gossip rags and paparazzi shots. Lila studied him for a long moment, and Chase found himself holding his breath. There was something disarming about her direct gaze, like she could see right through his carefully constructed public image to the man underneath who just wanted a normal life. And what's in it for you? She finally asked, her head tilted slightly. Honestly, a chance to show I'm not just what those magazines make me out to be. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never managed to break, one that his mother used to tease him about during high school games. Plus, your brother might hate me slightly less if I help your business instead of hurting it. That earned him a small smile, genuine this time, and Chase felt an unexpected flutter in his chest at the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. Drew's overprotective nature isn't your problem. No, but his opinion of me as a coach kind of is, Chase replied, trying not to focus on how her smile transformed her entire face, brightening the already sun-filled shop. He'd seen plenty of beautiful women in his time, but there was something different about Lila's natural, unaffected charm. Lila sighed, uncrossing her arms. Fine. But we do this my way. No flashy publicity stunts, no unauthorized photos. Just genuine promotion for a local business. Deal, Chase agreed, relief washing over him like a cool breeze. I can work with that. Maybe this was his chance to prove he could be more than just tabloid fodder, more than the caricature the media had created of him over the years. As if on cue, his phone buzzed against his thigh. It was a text from his agent with a link to new photos. Him leaving Salty Waves that morning, the headlines already spinning tales of a budding romance. His stomach dropped as he realized how much harder this arrangement had just become. He could already imagine the calls he'd be fielding tomorrow. Lila's phone chimed moments later, and she groaned, running a hand through her hair. Drew's going to love this. Sure enough, later that evening at the field, Chase overheard Drew venting to Ethan near the equipment shed. He'd been gathering his gear after an extended practice session, his muscles aching from the extra reps he'd pushed himself through, when their voices carried across the cooling evening air. First practice and he's already causing problems, Drew was saying, his frustration evident in every sharp word. Did you see those photos? The way they're spinning it, making it look like he's pursuing her? The anger in Drew's voice made Chase's jaw clench, reminding him of just how much ground he had to make up with his new quarterback coach. I saw them, Ethan replied calmly, his steady voice a stark contrast to Drew's agitation. I also saw him running perfect plays today, and staying late to work with the receivers. Maybe focus on that. The guy's putting in the work. But Lila? Can handle herself, Ethan cut in, with the kind of authority that came from years of leadership. You've got enough on your plate with the team, Drew. Let your sister make her own choices. Chase moved away before they noticed him, but not before catching the weariness in Ethan's voice. The slight strain, the underlying tension, it couldn't be easy for someone like him, a natural leader, a hometown hero, to watch from the sidelines while someone else stepped into his role. Chase knew that feeling all too well, being sidelined by circumstances beyond his control. He'd spent months watching games from his couch last season, nursing an injury while the media speculated about his future. As Chase headed to his car, keys jingling in his hand, he felt the full weight of his situation settle onto his shoulders. The cool metal pressed against his palm, grounding him in reality as his mind raced through the complications ahead. He hadn't just stepped into a temporary quarterback position, he'd stepped into a complex web of relationships and expectations. Drew's fierce protectiveness, Ethan's forced sideline perspective, Lila's careful wariness, it all mattered more than any playbook he'd ever studied. And somehow, he had to find a way to navigate it all without fumbling the one chance he had at proving himself worthy of their trust. The photos Drew mentioned weren't helping his case, even though they'd been completely innocent moments, twisted by hungry paparazzi lenses into something else entirely. He'd have to earn their trust both on and off the field. And for the first time in a long time, Chase found himself genuinely wanting to. Chapter 3, the mystery woman appears. The bell above Salty Waves' door chimed, and Lila looked up from her inventory spreadsheet, expecting another tourist hunting for surf gear. Instead, she found herself face to face with what looked like a magazine cover come to life. A woman with perfect auburn hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and an outfit that probably cost more than Lila's monthly rent. "Can I help you?" Lila asked, already sensing trouble in the woman's calculated smile. Something about the way she carried herself, like she owned not just the shop but the whole town, set off warning bells in Lila's mind. The woman's Louboutin heels clicked against the weathered wooden floor, completely impractical for a beach town, and Lila fought the urge to point out the no street shoes sign by the door. "I'm looking for Chase." The woman's voice carried the practiced sweetness of artificial honey, the kind that left a bitter aftertaste. "I'm Vanessa Hartley. His girlfriend." Lila's stomach dropped, a cold weight settling in her chest. The handful of customers browsing the shop suddenly went quiet, their attention laser-focused on the scene unfolding. Even Mrs. Henderson, who'd been examining wetsuits for her grandson, stopped mid-reach, her weathered hands frozen on the neoprene as if touching it might make her miss something juicy. "Chase isn't here," Lila said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter, seeking an anchor. "And this is a surf shop, not his personal concierge service." Vanessa's laugh tinkled like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "Oh, sweetie. I know he's been spending time here. The photos are all over social media." She pulled out her phone, perfectly manicured nails tapping the screen as she scrolled through what looked like paparazzi shots of Chase leaving Salty Waves. The morning sun streaming through the front windows caught the massive diamond on her ring finger, sending prisms dancing across the walls. "Though I can't imagine why. This place is so quaint." The way she said quaint made it sound like a disease, and Lila felt her jaw clench. This was her dream, her life's work, and this woman was dismissing it like last season's handbag. The familiar scent of surf wax and ocean air that usually brought her comfort now felt somehow tainted by Vanessa's presence. "If you're looking for Chase, try the football field." Lila moved toward the door, hoping Vanessa would take the hint. The sooner she left, the better. Her flip-flops squeaked against the floor, a jarring contrast to Vanessa's designer footwear. "We're actually pretty busy." "Oh my God, is that Vanessa Hartley?" A teenage girl near the sunscreen display whispered loudly to her friend, practically bouncing on her toes. Her phone was already out, angled not so subtly for a photo. She was just in that reality show. Perfect. Just perfect. Exactly what her quiet morning needed. A D-list celebrity causing chaos in her shop, sending her carefully organized day spiraling into tabloid territory. Camera flashes suddenly lit up the shop windows like lightning, transforming the peaceful morning into a media circus. Somehow, the paparazzi had materialized out of thin air, pressing against the glass like hungry seagulls spotting a dropped sandwich. Their cameras clicked incessantly, and Lila could already imagine the headlines they'd spin from this. She'd worked too hard building Salty Waves' reputation to have it reduced to some trashy gossip column sidebar. "You should probably leave," Lila said firmly, her patience evaporating faster than a puddle in August. Her fingers drummed against her thigh, a nervous habit she'd never quite kicked. "Now? But I haven't shown you the best part." Vanessa dug through her designer bag, probably worth more than Lila's monthly inventory, producing a small stack of photos with the flourish of a magician revealing their grand finale. "See? Here we are at the charity gala last month. And these texts? Get out?" Lila's voice could have frozen Hawaii. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she fought to maintain her professional composure, the tang of coconut wax suddenly cloying in her nose. "This is private property, and you're disrupting my business." The door chimed again, sending a jolt through her already frayed nerves, and Chase burst in, looking like he'd sprinted from wherever he'd been. His normally perfect hair was windswept, his chest heaving slightly. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his practice jersey was askew. His eyes locked onto Vanessa, and his expression hardened into something Lila had never seen before on his usually warm face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Baby?" Vanessa moved to embrace him, her designer heels clicking against the shop's wooden floor, but Chase stepped back as if avoiding a striking snake. The movement was so quick it made Lila's breath catch. "I've missed you so much. Why haven't you been returning my calls?" "Because we've never dated," Chase said flatly, each word precise and cold as winter rain. His hands were steady at his sides, but Lila could see the tension in his shoulders. "We met once, at a publicity event. That's it." "But the photos?" Vanessa waved them dramatically, her bracelet jangling with the movement, the sound grating against Lila's already raw nerves. "Or from a group photo at a charity event," Chase cut in. "Which you've clearly cropped. Did you really think nobody would notice?" The paparazzi outside were having a field day, their cameras clicking like hungry teeth. Through the glass, Lila could see them jostling for position, fighting for the perfect shot, their faces pressed so close to the windows they left smudges on her freshly cleaned glass. Her phone buzzed in her back pocket, Drew of course. She ignored it, though her brother's protective instincts had probably kicked into overdrive by now. She could practically hear his lecture already. "Chase," Vanessa's voice went soft, wounded, like a practiced actress hitting her mark. Her lower lip trembled in what had to be carefully rehearsed distress. "How can you say that? After everything we shared?" Lila watched Chase's face, searching for any hint of deception. His jaw was set, his green eyes blazing with what looked like genuine anger. The muscle in his cheek twitched, something she'd noticed he did when truly upset. But hadn't she seen enough celebrity scandals to know how good these people were at acting? How many times had she watched famous men swear their innocence on TV, only to be caught in lies weeks later? The cynical voice in her head, the one that sounded suspiciously like Drew, whispered warnings she couldn't quite ignore. "Enough." Lila moved between them, her patience completely evaporated. "Both of you out. Now. Take your drama somewhere else." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she planted her feet firmly on the weathered wooden floor of her shop. "Lila, please," Chase started, reaching toward her, but she held up her hand, creating a barrier between them. The familiar scent of his cologne made her head swim, and she forced herself to take a step back. "Out?" The door chimed again, Drew this time because of course he'd show up now, his protective big brother radar working overtime. The morning sun caught his sandy hair as he assessed the scene with the same intensity he used on the football field. "Everything okay in here, Lila?" "It's fine," she said through gritted teeth, tasting the lie. "Everyone who doesn't work here is leaving. Right now." Drew's presence seemed to finally convince Vanessa to make her exit, though she made sure to pause dramatically in the doorway, tossing her perfectly styled hair over one shoulder. "Chase, baby, call me when you're done playing small-town hero." The paparazzi swarmed her like she was throwing chum in shark-infested waters, their cameras clicking in rapid succession. Lila's stomach churned at the thought of her shop appearing in tomorrow's tabloids. "Lila?" Chase tried again, his voice carrying that soft note that usually made her knees weak. "I think you should go," Drew said, stepping forward, his protective instincts radiating off him in waves. For a moment, Chase looked like he might argue. Instead, he nodded once, his expression pained, the muscle in his jaw working overtime. "I'm sorry about this," he said to Lila. "All of it." Then he was gone, leaving Lila with a churning stomach and a shop full of gawking customers who'd forgotten all about shopping for beach gear. "I told you he was trouble," Drew said quietly, in that infuriatingly knowing older brother tone she'd heard since childhood. "Don't start." Lila busied herself straightening a display of flip-flops that didn't need straightening, focusing on the cheerful colors to ground herself. "I'm a big girl, Drew. I can handle myself." "Can you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're getting pulled into exactly the kind of mess I warned you about." He crossed his arms, looking every bit the quarterback coach laying down the law. "Nothing is pulling me anywhere," Lila snapped, even as doubt gnawed at her certainty. Her fingers twisted the hem of her tank top, a nervous habit she thought she'd outgrown years ago. The fabric bunched between her fingers like her tangled emotions. "And last time I checked, you're my brother, not my keeper." Drew's face softened, his expression so similar to the one he'd worn when she'd wiped out on her first wave as a kid. The memory of salt water in her nose and his steady hands pulling her up made her throat tight. "I'm trying to protect you." "I know." Lila sighed, the fight draining out of her like the evening tide. "But I don't need protection. I need space to make my own decisions, even if they turn out to be mistakes." "And is Chase Dalton a mistake you're planning to make?" Lila thought about Chase's eyes when he'd denied Vanessa's claims, the raw honesty in those green depths. The way he'd looked at Lila like she was the only person whose opinion mattered in a room full of judgmental stares. But she also thought about the chaos swirling around him, the way it had invaded her carefully ordered life like a hurricane, scattering her peace in all directions. The familiar comfort of her shop suddenly felt like it was closing in around her, the walls too close, the air too thick with tension and uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted, running a hand through her salt-tangled hair, feeling the familiar texture that always reminded her of long days at the beach. "But it's my choice to make." Drew nodded, though she could read the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders remained rigid with that big brother protectiveness she both loved and resented. "Just be careful, okay?" After he left, Lila walked to the front of the shop, her flip-flops echoing in the now empty space, and flipped the open sign to closed. Through the window, she could see reporters still lingering like seagulls after a beach picnic, their cameras at the ready, probably hoping Chase would return. Her phone buzzed again in her back pocket. The screen was already full of missed calls and texts, no doubt spreading the gossip about the scene at Salty Waves like wildfire through their small town. She could practically hear the whispers making their way from the beach to Main Street. She thought about Chase's apology, the sincerity in his voice that had cut through all the chaos, the way his green eyes had held hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that he differed from what the tabloids painted him to be. But another part, the practical protective part that had helped her build this business from scratch and kept her grounded through every storm, whispered warnings about fire and moths and getting burned. She'd worked too hard to let her carefully constructed world spiral into chaos. Maybe distance was the answer. Let Chase handle his drama and she'd focus on what she did best, running her shop, surfing when she could catch a break, and keeping her life as drama-free as possible. The ocean, at least, had never let her down. It had been her constant companion through every up and down, its waves washing away her doubts and fears with each session. Even if the thought of pushing him away made her chest ache in a way she wasn't ready to examine too closely, a hollow feeling that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. Chapter 4: Escalating Tension. Drew Carson watched the latest entertainment news segment with growing frustration, his jaw clenching as footage of his sister's surf shop played across the screen. The headline, "NFL Star's Secret Small-Town Romance," scrolled beneath shots of Chase leaving Salty Waves. His stomach churned at the familiar media circus he'd witnessed countless times during his own pro career, but this time it was different. This time it was personal. "Turn that garbage off," he muttered to himself, grabbing his keys and phone. The drive to Salty Waves was shorter than usual, his foot heavy on the accelerator as his protective instincts kicked into overdrive. He'd seen this kind of media frenzy before, and it never ended well for anyone involved. The memories of his own career-ending injury announcement and the subsequent media storm still left a bitter taste in his mouth. The shop's usually peaceful atmosphere was disrupted by the constant flash of cameras outside. Drew shouldered his way through a small crowd of photographers, earning a few choice words that he ignored. His muscles tensed with each camera click, fighting the urge to do more than just brush them aside. One particularly aggressive paparazzo tried to shove a camera in his face, but Drew brushed past him with the same determination he'd once used to dodge defensive linemen. Inside, Lila was arranging a display of surfboards with more force than necessary, her usual easy smile nowhere to be seen. The sight of her distress made his chest tighten with a familiar big brother ache. "You okay, sis?" "I'm fine." The sharp crack of a surfboard hitting the rack betrayed her mood. "Though I'd be better if my big brother wasn't hovering like I'm 16 again." She wouldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on straightening merchandise that was already perfectly aligned. The set of her shoulders reminded him of their mother's stubborn stance, a thought that only heightened his concern. Drew ran a hand through his hair, fighting to keep his voice level. The familiar scent of surf wax and ocean air that usually calmed him did nothing to ease the tension in his shoulders. His coaching instinct screamed at him to fix this, to protect his team, his family. This isn't about treating you like a kid. Have you seen the headlines? The tabloids are having a field day. Yeah, and whose fault is that? Lila spun to face him, eyes blazing with the same fire she'd had since they were kids. That fire had gotten her through their parents' divorce, through opening this shop, through everything life had thrown at her. But this time, Drew wasn't sure it would be enough. Chase didn't ask for this. That woman showed up out of nowhere, making ridiculous claims. Exactly my point. This is the kind of drama that follows him everywhere. And now it's affecting your business, your reputation. Drew gestured at the chaos visible through the front windows, where more photographers were gathering like vultures. His throat tightened as he watched another customer try to navigate through the media gauntlet, then turn away. My reputation? Lila laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm a grown woman, Drew. I can handle my own reputation. Can you? Because from where I'm standing, you're getting pulled into his circus, and it's only been a few days. The words came out harsher than he intended, but seeing his sister's dream being turned into tabloid fodder made his blood boil. He'd watched her pour everything into this shop, staying up late doing inventory, missing social events to handle paperwork, living and breathing this place until it became her second home. The bell above the door chimed as a customer entered, then quickly retreated upon sensing the tension. Drew noticed Lila's shoulders slump slightly, and guilt gnawed at him. This was exactly what he'd been worried about, her business suffering because of Chase's presence. The shop that she'd built from the ground up, that had become a cornerstone of their community, was turning into a spectacle. His sister deserved better than to have her hard work overshadowed by some quarterback's drama, no matter how talented the guy might be. You don't get to make my decisions for me, Lila said quietly, her voice carrying an edge he rarely heard. I appreciate that you care, but you need to back off. Later that afternoon, Drew's mood hadn't improved by the time practice started. He watched Chase running drills with the offense, his movements precise and professional. The guy was good, Drew had to give him that. Every pass was perfectly placed, every play executed with the kind of skill that had made him famous. But talent wasn't the issue here. Drew had seen too many talented players wreck everything around them with their off-field antics, and he'd be damned if he'd let that happen to his sister. Dalton, Drew called out during a water break. A word? Chase jogged over, wiping sweat from his forehead with a practice motion that reminded Drew of countless post-game interviews he'd seen the quarterback give. What's up, coach? This media circus, it needs to stop. The team can't focus with paparazzi hanging around, and my sister. Look, Chase cut in, his easy demeanor shifting to something more serious, the celebrity charm dropping away like a mask. I get that you're protective of Lila. But what's happening between us is real. I'm not using her for publicity or whatever you think. Real? Drew scoffed, memories of countless celebrity relationships playing through his mind, the flashy courtships that lasted just long enough for a publicity boost, the tearful breakups splashed across magazine covers. You've known her for what, a week? And already she's dealing with fake girlfriends showing up at her shop, reporters harassing her customers. A commotion near the field's entrance interrupted them. Several photographers had managed to slip past security, their cameras already clicking away like hungry predators spotting fresh meat. The players noticed, their formation breaking as they turned to look. Drew felt his jaw clench, remembering simpler days when football was just about the game, when the biggest distraction was the local paper doing a write-up about Friday night's matchup. Hey! Drew shouted at the intruders, his voice carrying the authority of years spent commanding a field. This is a closed practice. Chase's expression darkened, a shadow passing over his features that made him look more human than superstar. I'll handle this. He started toward the photographers, but Drew grabbed his arm, feeling the same protective instinct that had driven him to Salty Waves earlier. That's exactly what they want. More drama, more pictures. Then what do you suggest? Chase demanded, frustration evident in the tight set of his shoulders. Because I'm trying here, Drew. I'm trying to do right by your sister and this team, but I can't control what other people do. Security finally arrived to escort the photographers out, but the damage was done. The team's rhythm was shot, and Drew could hear the muttering from his players. Scattered conversations about autographs and social media drifted across the field, replacing the usual focused chatter about plays and formations. This wasn't just about Lila anymore. The whole town was feeling the effects of Chase's presence, like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped in still water. During his afternoon coffee run, Drew overheard locals at Seaside Sips discussing the situation. "It used to be so peaceful here," one regular complained, stirring her latte with more force than necessary. "Now we can't even grab a coffee without seeing those vultures with cameras." Another chimed in about the traffic congestion near the practice field, and someone else grumbled about tourists asking for directions to Chase's rumored residence. The conversation died as Drew approached the counter, but the sideways glances told him plenty about who they blamed. Drew's guilt intensified when he stopped by Salty Waves again that evening and found Lila closing early. She was turning away a group of teenage girls who were clearly there hoping to catch a glimpse of Chase, their disappointed faces pressed against the shop windows even as she flipped the sign to closed. One of them had a jersey with Chase's old team number, and Drew felt his jaw clench at the sight. "This isn't what I wanted," he said softly, helping her lower the security gate. The metal rattled under his hands, a harsh sound in the quiet evening air. A few straggling photographers lurked across the street, their cameras still at the ready. "I know." Lila's voice was tired, missing its usual spark. "But Chase isn't the problem. He's trying to handle it the best he can." She rubbed her temples, a gesture so reminiscent of their mother that it made Drew's chest ache. Drew noticed she wouldn't quite meet his eyes, and his sister's usual confident demeanor seemed dimmed. The sight reminded him painfully of when she was younger, after their parents' divorce, when she'd tried to put on a brave face but couldn't quite manage it. She'd worn that same expression when their dad missed her high school graduation, making excuses about work commitments. Had his warnings gotten through to her? The victory felt hollow. "Have you talked to him today?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, though his hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. A camera flash went off in the distance, and he had to resist the urge to storm across the street. "No." Lila fiddled with the lock, the keys jingling softly. I need some time to think. This is all happening so fast, and maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not ready for this level of attention." Her shoulders slumped slightly, and Drew fought the instinct to pull her into a protective hug like he used to when they were kids. The admission should have made Drew feel vindicated. Instead, watching his typically vibrant sister shrink away from something or someone that clearly mattered to her left a sour taste in his mouth. He'd seen Lila tackle every challenge head-on since she was old enough to walk. Seeing her retreat now felt wrong on a fundamental level. She was the one who'd started her own business at 23, who'd learned to surf in spite of their mother's protests, who never backed down from what she wanted. This wasn't the sister he knew. As they walked to their cars, Drew spotted Chase across the street, talking intently with the owner of the local community center. Even from this distance, Drew could see the earnest expression on Chase's face, the way he gestured passionately about whatever they were discussing. The quarterback's entire demeanor radiated sincerity, something Drew hadn't expected from the supposed playboy of the NFL. Despite his curiosity, Drew steered Lila in the opposite direction, but not before noticing the way her steps faltered, like she wanted to go to him. The protective brother in him wanted to celebrate this distance between them, but the coach who'd watched countless players push through adversity wondered if he was doing more harm than good. Drew lay awake that night, replaying the day's events. The ceiling fan spun lazy circles above his bed, doing little to quiet his racing thoughts. His phone buzzed with a text from Ethan, saw the practice footage online. Teams rattled. Maybe ease up on Dalton? Guy's trying. Was he? Drew had been so focused on protecting Lila and the team that he hadn't stopped to consider if his actions were making things worse. The memory of Lila's defeated expression as she closed the shop early nagged at him, twisting his stomach into knots. His sister had always been a force of nature, confident and unstoppable, the kind of person who'd jump into the ocean during a storm just to prove she could swim through it. Seeing her doubt herself felt wrong, and for the first time, Drew wondered if his protective instincts were causing more damage than Chase's presence ever could. The thought settled heavy in his chest, keeping sleep at bay as the night stretched on. Chapter 5: Public Gesture. Chase stood in front of Salty Waves, watching as volunteers set up tables and banners for the Oceanview Community Day event. The morning sun painted everything in a soft golden light, and the salty breeze carried the promise of a perfect beach day. He'd spent the past week organizing this, hoping to show both Lila and the town that he was more than just tabloid fodder. "You really think this will work?" Drew's voice carried a hint of skepticism as he approached, clipboard in hand, squinting against the morning sun. Chase turned to face him, noting how Drew's stance remained guarded despite agreeing to co-host. The coach's shoulders were tense, his fingers drumming against the clipboard in a restless rhythm. Every tap felt like an accusation. "Worth a shot, isn't it? Besides, your sister's shop deserves the attention, the right kind this time." He tried to keep his tone light, though the weight of recent media coverage pressed down on him like a heavy jersey after a rough game. Drew's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd of volunteers who were setting up carnival games and information booths along the boardwalk. "Just remember, this isn't about you showing off for the cameras. Trust me, I've had enough of cameras to last a lifetime." Chase meant it too. The past few weeks had been a circus, and he was tired of seeing his face splashed across gossip sites, usually with some ridiculous headline about him and Lila. Each news story felt like another brick in the wall between them, another obstacle he had to somehow overcome. Speaking of Lila, she emerged from the shop wearing a navy tank top with the Salty Waves logo, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun that caught the sunlight. She looked beautiful, but the wariness in her eyes when she glanced his way made his chest tighten. The same look he'd seen too many times lately, ever since the paparazzi started camping outside her store. He fought the urge to cross the distance between them, to explain that none of the headlines mattered, that he wasn't the player they made him out to be. "Everything's set up inside," she said, addressing Drew more than Chase, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her tank top. "The raffle tickets are ready, and the local vendors are getting their booths organized." Her voice was professional, distant, so different from the warmth he'd glimpsed in their earlier conversations. Chase stepped forward, careful not to move too close, knowing how easily the smallest gesture could be misinterpreted these days. "I got some of my old teammates to donate signed merchandise for the auction. All proceeds go to local businesses and the youth sports program." He'd spent hours on the phone calling in favors, determined to make this event matter. That caught her attention. She met his eyes briefly, and he saw a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe even appreciation, before she looked away. The morning breeze carried the scent of her coconut shampoo, making his heart skip. It was a small moment, but it felt like progress, like maybe there was still hope of breaking down those walls, one brick at a time. The event kicked off at 10, and within an hour the beach in front of Salty Waves was packed with locals and tourists alike. Chase moved through the crowd with practiced ease, making sure to highlight each local vendor's contribution. He posed for photos with kids, signed autographs, and directed attention to the auction items whenever possible, channeling all his media training into promoting the community rather than himself. The familiar rhythm of meet and greets felt different here, more genuine, less performative. "And here we have Sarah's famous saltwater taffy," he announced, gesturing to a colorful booth nearby, the sweet scent of sugar and sea salt mixing with the ocean air. "Best on the coast, trust me, I've tried them all this week. Research purposes, of course." The crowd laughed, and Sarah's booth was suddenly swarmed with customers, her weathered face breaking into a grateful smile. Chase felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. This was what he'd hoped for, helping the small businesses that gave Oceanview its charm. From the corner of his eye, he caught Drew watching him, arms crossed over his chest. The coach's expression had softened slightly, though he still maintained his protective position near Lila's shop entrance, like a sentinel guarding a treasure. Chase understood the instinct. He'd want to protect someone like Lila too. The morning progressed smoothly, the excitement building with each passing hour. Chase had hired additional security to keep the paparazzi at a respectful distance, allowing locals to enjoy the event without feeling like they were part of a media circus. The team he'd chosen was discreet but effective, positioned strategically around the perimeter. He was just about to announce the first round of raffle winners, the bowl of tickets balanced in his hands, when a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Chase, darling. Aren't you going to introduce me to everyone?" His stomach dropped, a familiar sense of dread washing over him. Veronica Maxwell, the woman claiming to be his girlfriend, sashayed through the parting crowd in a dress that was completely impractical for the beach, her stilettos sinking into the wooden planks of the boardwalk with each deliberate step. Camera flashes immediately started going off in the distance, exactly as she'd planned, no doubt. The security team moved forward, but Chase knew the damage was already done. Chase saw Lila freeze behind the shop's counter, her expression hardening into the mask he'd been dreading. The light that usually danced in her eyes dimmed, and his chest tightened at the sight. All his careful planning, all the progress he'd made in showing her who he really was, it was crumbling before his eyes. Drew was already moving toward his sister with that protective stance Chase had come to know well, but Chase got there first, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "This is a private event, Veronica," he said firmly, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest and the slight tremor in his hands. He fought to maintain his composure, knowing every eye in the crowd was on them. "You need to leave." "Private? With all these cameras around?" She laughed, a practice sound that grated on his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Her perfectly manicured hand gestured to the crowd gathering around them. "I thought you'd want your girlfriend here to support you." "Cut the act." Chase stepped closer, his shadow falling over Veronica, as he lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper that he reserved for confrontations he never wanted to have. The familiar scent of her expensive perfume made his stomach turn. "We both know you're not my girlfriend. Never have been, never will be. I've got proof of your lies, including the dated photos you doctored. Every single one of them. Right down to the fake dinner date at Giovanni's, where you photoshopped yourself into a 3-year-old picture." Veronica's smile faltered slightly, a crack in her perfectly crafted facade. Her left eye twitched, a tell he'd noticed during their previous encounters. "You wouldn't dare make a scene." "Wouldn't I?" Chase turned to address the crowd, which had gone quiet, the only sounds the distant crash of waves and the click of cameras. The sea of faces stared back at him, phones raised like weapons. "Everyone, I need to address something. This woman has been spreading lies about me for weeks now, disrupting not just my life, but this entire town. I've stayed quiet, hoping she'd do the right thing, but enough is enough. I won't let her poison what I'm building here." He pulled out his phone with steady hands, though his heart was racing beneath his composed exterior, pulling up emails he'd received from his lawyer. The documentation was damning, and he'd memorized every detail. "I have evidence that Ms. Maxwell was paid by a tabloid to fabricate this relationship. The photos she's been showing around? Digitally altered. The intimate details she's been sharing? All lies crafted to sell magazines and generate clicks. I've got the receipts from the photo editor she hired." Veronica's face had gone pale, her confident demeanor crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. The perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fury in her eyes as she glared at him. "You're just trying to protect your new small-town romance," she spat, gesturing toward Lila with a dismissive wave that made Chase's blood boil. He fought the urge to step between them, knowing Veronica's tactics all too well. "No," Chase said firmly, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd, steady despite the anger churning in his gut. "I'm protecting the truth. And the truth is, you're trespassing at a private event." "Security?" Two men in black shirts appeared beside Veronica, materializing from the crowd like shadows. They gently but firmly escorted her away as she protested loudly, her voice growing more shrill with each step, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing wildly in the air. The crowd murmured, some filming on their phones, others shaking their heads in disgust at her behavior. Chase knew this would be all over social media within minutes, another headline in the endless circus his life had become. He could already picture the clickbait, NFL star's ex causes scene at small-town shop. Chase turned to find Lila staring at him, her expression unreadable behind the counter of her shop. His heart stuttered in his chest at the uncertainty in her eyes, that spark of connection they'd been building now dimmed by doubt. The salty breeze from the ocean felt cold against his skin as he watched everything he'd been hoping for start to crumble. Before he could speak, Drew was there, pulling her aside with the protectiveness of an older brother who'd seen too many hearts broken, who'd probably watched every tabloid story about Chase's supposed conquests. "Lila, you need to think about this," Drew said, loud enough for Chase to hear, his words cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. This could all be an act, some PR stunt to make him look good. Chase's heart sank as he watched Lila's face cloud with doubt, her teeth worrying her bottom lip in that way she did when she was uncertain, the same way she'd done when he'd first asked her out for coffee. She glanced between him and Drew, clearly torn between her growing feelings and her brother's warnings. The victory of exposing Veronica suddenly felt hollow as he realized he might have lost Lila's trust anyway, watching it slip through his fingers like grains of sand on her beloved beach. The irony wasn't lost on him. In protecting himself from one lie, he might have just confirmed everyone's worst fears about him. He stepped away from the crowd, needing a moment to clear his head, to breathe in the salt air that usually brought him peace. The security team had successfully removed Veronica, but the damage was done. Already he could see people checking their phones, probably reading whatever spin the media was putting on the confrontation, their faces illuminated by blue light as they absorbed the latest drama in the Chase Dalton saga. His stomach churned at the thought of tomorrow's headlines, the way they'd twist this into another scandal, another reason why the superstar quarterback couldn't be trusted. This wasn't how he'd planned for the day to go. He'd wanted to show Lila and Drew that he could be more than just a source of drama in their lives, that he was capable of being the steady, reliable presence they both needed. Instead, the drama had found them again, crashing into their peaceful morning like a rogue wave, and he was running out of ways to prove his sincerity. The raffle tickets in his hands suddenly felt heavy, a reminder of the simple, joyful event this was supposed to be. He'd imagined walking the boardwalk with Lila, maybe winning her one of those ridiculous stuffed dolphins from the carnival games, seeing her laugh without reservation. Chase watched as Drew continued talking to Lila, his protective big brother mode in full force. The coach's words from their first meeting echoed in his head, "Stay away from my sister." But watching Lila now, seeing the conflict in her eyes as she glanced his way, Chase knew he couldn't do that. Not when his feelings for her were becoming impossible to ignore. Not when every smile she gave him felt like scoring the winning touchdown in the Super Bowl. A rush of pure joy that made everything else fade away. Chapter 6: A Rift Grows. Lila hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd only stopped by the practice field to drop off some youth league forms for Drew when she heard his voice carrying across the empty bleachers. "Look, I've seen his type before," Drew was saying to Tyler, one of the defensive coaches. "Different city every season, different girl every month. Remember that mess in Miami?" Lila's stomach clenched as she lingered behind the stands, unable to walk away. Her fingers twisted nervously in the hem of her tank top, a habit she'd had since childhood whenever she overheard something she shouldn't. "That was years ago," Tyler replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the empty field. "People change." "Maybe. But I'm not letting him use my sister as his small-town redemption story." Drew's words stung more than Lila wanted to admit. She'd been trying to ignore the tabloid headlines that seemed to multiply daily, but now they played on repeat in her mind like a broken record she couldn't shut off. The string of high-profile relationships, the sudden departures, the trail of broken hearts from coast to coast. Each new story made her stomach twist with doubt, threatening the careful walls she'd built around her growing feelings for Chase. Walking back to Salty Waves, she had to dodge two photographers camped outside the beach bistro, their long lens cameras pointed like weapons at anyone who passed by. Their constant presence had turned the once peaceful promenade into a gauntlet of camera flashes and shouted questions. Just yesterday, Mrs. Henderson had complained that the paparazzi were scaring away customers from her flower shop. The elderly woman's prized hydrangeas wilted in their display buckets, untouched by the usual stream of weekend shoppers, their purple and blue blooms drooping sadly in the afternoon sun. "This isn't what Oceanview is about," the elderly woman had said, shaking her head, her weathered hands trembling as she adjusted her flowers. "All this Hollywood nonsense. In my 40 years here, I've never seen such foolishness." Lila couldn't disagree. The town she loved was changing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was partly responsible. If she hadn't let Chase in, if she'd listened to her brother's warnings from the start, maybe the town would still have its peace. The thought sat heavy in her chest, like the humid summer air before a storm, and she found herself wondering if the spark between her and Chase was worth the hurricane it seemed to be bringing to her peaceful coastal life. The bell above her shop door chimed, and speak of the devil, Chase walked in, his green eyes searching for her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. He looked tired, she noticed, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that even his usual charm couldn't quite mask. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his typically pristine appearance seemed slightly rumpled, as if he'd been running his hands through his hair all day. "Can we talk?" he asked, running a hand through his dark hair, messing it up in that way that usually made her want to smooth it back into place. The familiar gesture tugged at something in her chest, but she pushed the feeling away. "I'm actually pretty busy." Lila turned away, pretending to organize a display of surf wax that was already perfectly arranged. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the already straight rows, the scent of coconut and tropical wax doing nothing to calm her nerves. "Lila." His voice softened, carrying that hint of vulnerability that always seemed to break through her defenses. "You've been avoiding me for days." "I haven't been," she stopped, knowing the lie would sound hollow. The weight of unspoken words hung between them like heavy storm clouds. "Fine. Talk. What's going on? Ever since that event, you've been different. Distant." He shifted his weight, and she could feel him watching her, waiting for some kind of explanation she wasn't sure she could give. "Maybe I'm just tired of my life turning into a circus," she said, finally meeting his gaze. The familiar flutter in her stomach warred with the frustration building in her chest. The photographers, the rumors, that woman showing up and causing scenes, this isn't what I signed up for. My customers can barely make it through the door without getting harassed. "I never wanted any of that." Chase stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne mixed with ocean air. The scent brought back memories of sunset walks and stolen kisses that made her heart ache. "You have to know that." "Do I?" The words burst out before she could stop them, sharp and bitter as sea spray. "Because from what I hear, drama follows you everywhere. Miami, Seattle, Chicago, it's always the same story, isn't it? So you've been listening to the gossip." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his tanned skin. The hurt in his eyes made her want to take back her words, but she held firm. "I thought you were different." "Different from what? The other women who got tired of living in a fishbowl? Who couldn't handle having their every move dissected by strangers?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the emotion she was trying so hard to keep in check. "That's not fair." Chase's voice rose, his hands clenching at his sides. "Everything you've heard, those stories, they're not the whole truth. I came here to get away from all that, to find something real. Something honest for once in my life." "Well, congratulations," Lila shot back, anger and hurt mixing in her chest until she could barely breathe. "You found a quaint little beach town to hide in. But some of us actually live here, Chase. This isn't just your temporary escape. This is my home, my life, and you're turning it upside down. Every time I turn around, there's another photographer lurking behind a surfboard, or another reporter trying to get the inside scoop." The bell chimed again as a customer walked in, then quickly backed out upon sensing the tension. Lila watched another sale slip away, another small reminder of how Chase's presence was affecting her life. Her fingers drummed against the counter, a nervous habit she'd picked up since this whole mess began. That was the third potential customer today who'd done a quick about-face at her door. At this rate, she'd be lucky to make rent this month. Later that evening, she sat at the counter of Seaside Sips, nursing a cappuccino while Maggie wiped down tables. The familiar scent of coffee and vanilla usually brought her comfort, but tonight, it did little to settle the unease in her stomach. Even the sound of waves crashing outside couldn't calm her racing thoughts. "I don't know what to do, Mags," Lila admitted, watching the foam swirl in her cup, creating patterns that seemed as complicated as her feelings. "When I'm with him, everything feels right. Like puzzle pieces clicking into place. But then reality crashes in, and I start wondering if I'm being naive. If I'm just another girl falling for that famous Dalton charm." "About Chase?" Maggie paused her cleaning, the rag dangling from her hand as she fixed Lila with one of her knowing looks. "Or about what other people think of Chase?" "Both?" "Neither?" Lila groaned, dropping her head into her hands, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Drew's so convinced Chase is bad news, and maybe he's right. I mean, look at his track record. The tabloids aren't exactly singing his praises. Every relationship he's had has ended up splashed across magazine covers. "Drew's protective," Maggie said gently, moving behind the counter to stand closer, her presence as comforting as always. "But he's not always right. Remember when he tried to talk you out of opening Salty Waves? Said it was too risky, that you'd never make it work?" "That was different." Lila twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit from childhood that surfaced whenever she felt cornered. The memory of that argument with Drew still stung, even though she'd proven him wrong. "Was it?" Maggie leaned against the counter, fixing Lila with that knowing look she'd perfected over years of friendship. "You knew what you wanted then, and you didn't let anyone's doubt stop you. Maybe the question isn't whether Chase is right or wrong for you. Maybe it's whether you're willing to trust your own judgment." Through the cafe window, Lila could see more paparazzi gathering near the practice field, their cameras glinting in the late afternoon sun like hungry predators waiting to pounce. She'd heard Chase was meeting with his PR team today, trying to get ahead of the mystery woman's claims. The whole situation felt like a movie playing out in her backyard, and she wasn't sure if she wanted a starring role. This wasn't some romantic comedy, this was her life, her business, her heart on the line. Everything she'd worked so hard to build could crumble under the weight of tabloid headlines and public scrutiny. On the field, Coach Caldwell's voice boomed across the grass, carrying even through the cafe's thick windows. "Dalton? Get your head in the game. That's the third missed pass today. We've got scouts coming next week." Lila watched Chase shake his head, clearly distracted. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved with less of his usual confidence, like he was carrying the weight of the world. His perfect spiral was off, his timing just a fraction too slow. Was she part of that distraction? The thought made her chest ache in a way she wasn't ready to examine, a feeling that was becoming all too familiar whenever she caught sight of him. "You know what the worst part is?" she said finally, turning back to Maggie, twisting that same strand of hair around her finger. "I keep thinking about that day he first walked into my shop. Before all this chaos, before the cameras and the drama. He just seemed so genuine. Like maybe he really did come here looking for something real. The way he smiled when he saw that old longboard on the wall, how he actually knew what he was talking about when it came to surfing. It wasn't just some act. And now? Now I don't know if I'm strong enough to find out." Lila traced the rim of her coffee cup, watching the last wisps of steam rise and disappear into the air-conditioned cafe. What if Drew's right? What if I'm just setting myself up for heartbreak? I've worked too hard to let everything fall apart because of some guy, even if that guy makes my heart do backflips every time he walks into a room and looks at me like I'm the only person who matters. Maggie's response was cut short by a commotion outside. Through the window they could see Chase striding across the street, phone pressed to his ear, his expression determined. Something had changed, there was a new energy in his step, a sense of purpose that made Lila's heart skip. His jaw was set, his free hand clenched at his side, and she recognized that look from the footage of his game-winning plays. He was done playing defense. She tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him, but her body had other ideas. "I should go," she said, standing quickly and gathering her things. "The shop's been quiet enough lately. I can't afford to leave it closed any longer." Not to mention she wasn't ready to face Chase, not when her emotions were still so raw and tangled. But as she walked back to Salty Waves, dodging curious glances and whispered conversations, she couldn't shake the feeling that pushing Chase away might be the biggest mistake she'd made since opening her shop. The question was, which was scarier, taking a chance on him or spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been? Chapter 7, Clearing the Air. Chase sat in his rental house, staring at the phone in his hand. The recording felt like a ticking bomb, one that would either blow up in his face or clear the minefield around him. His hands were slightly clammy as he hit play again, letting the mystery woman's voice fill the room, bouncing off the bare walls he hadn't bothered to decorate. "Fine, I made it all up. Are you happy now?" Her voice crackled through the speaker, tinged with frustration and defeat. "Chase Dalton never even looked at me twice. I just wanted my 15 minutes. The confession had cost him a small fortune, and some creative negotiating through his lawyer, but it was worth every penny. Not for his reputation, he'd weathered worse storms in his career, including that mess in Denver last season with the fake injury scandal, but for Lila. For the peace of this little town that had started to feel more like home than anywhere else he'd been, with its salt-scented air and friendly faces that didn't expect him to be anyone but himself. Here he wasn't Chase Dalton, superstar quarterback. He was just Chase, the guy who ordered the same coffee every morning at the local cafe, and sometimes helped old Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries. He fired off a quick text to his publicist, attaching the audio file. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against his thigh. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with her response, "Going live in 5. Brace yourself." The words made his stomach clench, but there was no turning back now. Chase walked to his window, running a hand through his dark hair as he watched the waves crash against the shore. The same waves he'd watched Lila surf that morning, her graceful movements a stark contrast to the chaos she'd been avoiding, chaos he'd brought to her doorstep like an unwanted hurricane. The memory of her smile, so rare these past few weeks, twisted something in his chest. He'd give anything to see that carefree grin again, the one she'd flashed at him the first time they'd met at her shop, before his fame had complicated everything. Before the mystery woman had shown up with her lies and turned Lila's world upside down. His phone exploded with notifications as the story broke. Major sports networks, entertainment sites, and social media channels all picked up the confession. The mystery woman's lies unraveled in real time, and Chase watched as his name began trending for all the right reasons for once. ESPN was already running the story on their ticker, and his agent had left 3 voicemails about damage control and PR opportunities. But Chase didn't care about any of that anymore. The spotlight that had once felt like home now seemed hollow compared to what really mattered. But he couldn't celebrate yet. There was someone else he needed to talk to first, someone whose opinion mattered more than any sports analyst or Twitter thread. Someone who could make or break his chances at the only thing worth fighting for now. Drew's house sat on a quiet street near the practice field, a modest single-story with surfboards propped against the garage. Chase had driven past it dozens of times but never stopped. Now, standing on the porch with his heart in his throat, he felt more nervous than before any game he'd ever played, including the championship. His palms were sweating, and he wiped them against his jeans, feeling like a rookie all over again. Drew opened the door, his expression guarded, arms crossed over his chest. "Dalton." His voice carried the weight of brotherly protection, and Chase recognized the look in his eyes. He'd worn it himself whenever his own sister was concerned. "Got a minute?" Chase fought to keep his voice steady, knowing everything, his relationship with Lila, his place in this town, hinged on this conversation. The sound of waves in the distance reminded him of her, of everything he stood to lose. Drew studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. "Make it quick. I've got film to review." The words were clipped, but at least he was letting Chase in. Chase followed him into a living room, decorated with football memorabilia and family photos. His eyes caught on one of a younger Drew, with his arm around Lila at what looked like her high school graduation. She had the same radiant smile even then, the kind that made his chest tight whenever he saw it now. The kind he'd do anything to protect, even if it meant facing down her protective older brother and laying every card on the table. "I'm guessing you've seen the news," Chase said, turning to face Drew. His stomach churned as he remembered the media frenzy of the past few days, the headlines, the accusations, the countless calls from his agent warning him to lay low. But laying low wasn't what he needed right now. "Hard to miss when it's blowing up my phone." Drew crossed his arms, his stance as defensive as any linebacker Chase had faced. "Nice work exposing her. But if you're here for a pat on the back..." "I'm not." Chase ran a hand through his hair, feeling the familiar tension headache building behind his eyes, the same one that had plagued him through countless press conferences and damage control meetings. "Look, I know you think I'm just some hotshot quarterback who's going to mess up your sister's life. And maybe a few months ago, you would have been right. God knows I made enough mistakes to earn that reputation." Drew's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, his stance rigid and watchful like a guard dog sizing up a potential threat. "But Lila, she's different." Chase struggled to find the right words, knowing this might be his only chance to make Drew understand. His palms were sweating like he was facing 4th and long in the final minutes of a championship game. "She doesn't care about the fame or the money. Hell, she actively hates it. She's real in a way I haven't experienced in years, and He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion that surprised even him. "I care about her. More than I expected to. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time." "That's what I'm afraid of," Drew said quietly, his words carrying the weight of brotherly concern. "Because when Ethan's better and you head back to the big leagues, what happens to her?" The question hit Chase like a blindside tackle, forcing the air from his lungs and making his chest ache with possibilities he hadn't let himself consider. "I don't know," he admitted, hating the uncertainty in his voice. "But I do know I'm not running away from this. From her. Whatever happens with football, Lila isn't some temporary distraction. She's become..." He trailed off, unable to voice just how essential she'd become to his life. Drew studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable as a poker player's. "If you hurt her, you'll make my next injury look like a paper cut?" Chase managed a small smile, though his heart was racing faster than any 2-minute drill. "Something like that." Drew uncrossed his arms, his posture softening slightly. "She's at the shop. Usually stays late on Thursdays doing inventory." Chase nodded, understanding the unspoken permission in Drew's words. "Thanks, Drew." "Don't thank me yet. She's still mad as hell." The walk to Salty Waves felt longer than usual, each step weighted with anticipation and nerves that rivaled pre-game jitters. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected off the shop's windows, creating a backdrop worthy of any romantic gesture. Through the glass, he could see Lila moving between shelves, clipboard in hand, completely focused on her task. Even angry, she moved with a grace that made his heart skip, her presence more magnetic than any stadium spotlight he'd ever stood under. His palms were sweating like they did before a championship game, and he wiped them absently on his jeans. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the familiar scent of surf wax and ocean air washing over him. Lila looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness, and Chase felt his resolve strengthen. He wasn't leaving until she heard him out, even if it meant camping out all night among the surfboards and beach gear. "We're closed," she said, turning back to her clipboard with the kind of deliberate focus that screamed she was trying to ignore his presence. The tension in her shoulders betrayed her attempt at nonchalance. "I know." Chase stayed by the door, giving her space, fighting the urge to cross the distance between them. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the moment feel even more fragile. A display of colorful beach towels caught the fading light, creating a kaleidoscope effect that matched his swirling emotions. I saw the close sign. But I was hoping you might make an exception. Like I made an exception before? Her pen scratched against paper with more force than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet shop. That worked out great. I deserved that. He took a careful step forward, his shoes squeaking slightly against the polished floor. The sound seemed to echo in the stillness between them, like a countdown to something inevitable. But I'm hoping you'll hear me out. Just once more. Lila set down her clipboard with a sigh that seemed to come from her soul, and the sound hit him harder than any linebacker ever had. Why should I? Because I got proof. He pulled out his phone with slightly trembling fingers, showing her the headlines that had been burning a hole in his pocket all day. The screen's glow illuminated his face in the dimming light. The woman confessed. It's all over the news. She glanced at the screen, her expression softening slightly, and Chase felt a flicker of hope in his chest, as delicate as a rookie's first touchdown pass. So you cleared your name. Congratulations. That's not why I did it. Chase moved closer, his heart pounding against his ribs like it did before a big game. The scent of her coconut shampoo mixed with the shop's beachy atmosphere, making his head spin. I did it because I couldn't stand seeing what this circus was doing to you. To your business. To this town. Chase. Let me finish, please. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his inability to express what he needed to say, feeling as tongue-tied as a rookie at his first press conference. The words he'd rehearsed on the walkover seemed to evaporate like morning fog. Do you know what it's like to live your life in a fishbowl? To have every relationship, every mistake, every private moment dissected by strangers? Lila shook her head slowly, a hint of understanding crossing her features. The last rays of sunlight caught in her hair, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch. It's exhausting, he continued, the words tumbling out now like a perfectly executed no-huddle offense. And after a while, you start to believe that's all there is. That every connection is going to be twisted into something ugly by the media. So you stop trying. Stop letting people in. He met her eyes, willing her to understand, to see past the headlines and rumors. But then I came here. Met you. And for the first time in years, I felt real. Not Chase Dalton, the quarterback. Just Chase. Lila's expression softened further, but she remained quiet, her silence both encouraging and terrifying. I know I messed up by not handling the situation better. By letting it affect you and your life here. He took another step closer, close enough now to catch the faint scent of her coconut shampoo. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that what I feel for you is real. That I'm not just passing through. And what about when the season starts? Lila asked quietly, voicing the fear he'd seen in her eyes for weeks. When you go back to your real life? This feels more real than anything I've had in years. He gestured around the shop, at the surfboards lining the walls and the salty breeze drifting through the open window. The team, this town, it's not a pit stop, Lila. It's becoming home. She studied him for a long moment, and Chase held his breath, feeling like he was waiting for the most important call of his career. Finally, she spoke. I talked to Drew earlier. Chase's stomach dropped, knowing how protective her brother could be. Oh? He said I should follow my heart. A small smile tugged at her lips, and Chase felt his hope soar. But also that if you hurt me, he'll make sure they never find your body. Sounds like Drew. Chase couldn't help but smile back. So, what is your heart saying? Lila took a deep breath. That maybe we could try. Slowly. Relief flooded through him. Slowly, he agreed. I can do slow. And no more surprise girlfriends? Promise. He held up his hands. Though I can't guarantee against more crazy people making claims. Fame tends to attract them. Then I guess we'll deal with them together. Lila picked up her clipboard again. But right now, I really do need to finish this inventory. Need any help? She raised an eyebrow. You want to count surfboard wax and wetsuit sizes? I want to spend time with you, he said simply. Even if it means counting wetsuit sizes. Lila smiled, really smiled for the first time in days. All right, quarterback. Let's see how good you are with numbers. Chapter 8, Rekindling Trust. The morning sun painted streaks of gold across the ocean as Lila organized the display of surf wax near the front counter, arranging the colorful blocks by scent and water temperature. She'd already reorganized this display twice this morning, but the methodical task helped quiet her racing thoughts. Her mind drifted to Chase, who'd been stopping by regularly over the past week, always with a genuine smile and never with paparazzi in tow. Each visit felt more natural than the last, though she still caught herself searching for ulterior motives that weren't there, a habit she couldn't quite shake despite his consistent thoughtfulness. The way he remembered little details about her shop, asked questions about surfing, and seemed genuinely interested in her daily life made it harder to maintain her walls. You're doing that thing again, Maggie said from behind the counter, where she'd been helping sort through inventory sheets, her pen tapping against the clipboard. Her friend's knowing look was almost as annoying as her accuracy. That thing where you overthink everything until you talk yourself out of something good. Lila rolled her eyes, adjusting a display of tropical scented wax that didn't need adjusting. The coconut scent wafted up, reminding her of the way Chase had commented on it yesterday. I'm not overthinking. I'm just thinking about Chase. Maggie's knowing smirk made Lila want to throw a bar of surf wax at her. She settled for shooting her best friend a warning glare instead. Because that dreamy look on your face says otherwise. Before Lila could respond with what would have been a perfectly crafted denial, the bell above the door chimed, and Chase walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee from Seaside Sips. Her heart did a little flip that she immediately tried to suppress, though the warmth spreading through her chest was harder to ignore. The morning light caught his profile just right, making him look unfairly handsome in his casual jeans and Henley. Morning, he said, setting one of the cups beside her, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. The brief contact sent tingles up her arm. 2 pumps of vanilla, extra hot, just how you like it. I made sure they didn't skimp on the foam this time. The fact that he remembered her coffee order, and her complaint about yesterday's foam ratio, shouldn't have made her stomach flutter, but it did. Thanks, she managed, taking a sip to hide her smile and the blush she could feel creeping up her neck. So, about that surf competition this weekend, Chase said, leaning against the counter, his presence filling the small space in a way that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. I was thinking maybe I could help out. I mean, I can't surf to save my life, but I'm pretty good at heavy lifting and crowd control. Years of dodging reporters has to count for something, right? Lila studied him, noting the earnest look in his eyes and the way he shifted slightly, almost nervously, waiting for her answer. You want to volunteer at a local surf competition? No cameras, no publicity, just helping out. Why not? It's important to you, isn't it? He said it so simply, like that was reason enough. That was the thing about Chase. He had a way of making grand gestures feel completely natural, of turning what should have been headline-worthy moments into quiet acts of kindness. Over the past week, he'd shown up early to help her set up displays, stayed late to sweep the floors, and somehow managed to charm even her most skeptical regular customers with his genuine interest in their stories. Okay, she said finally, trying to ignore Maggie's triumphant grin from behind the counter. But fair warning, it gets pretty crazy around here during competitions. Like, 100 teenagers hopped up on energy drinks crazy. His grin widened, reaching his eyes in that way that made them crinkle at the corners. I think I can handle crazy. I play professional football, remember? The day of the competition arrived with perfect waves and clear skies, the kind of morning that made Lila fall in love with Oceanview all over again. Chase showed up at dawn, wearing board shorts and carrying a tray of coffee for the volunteer crew, helping Lila set up tents and registration tables with an enthusiasm that was infectious. She couldn't help but notice how he greeted everyone by name, asking about their families, or following up on previous conversations, proving with every interaction that his interest in her world went beyond just impressing her. The way he seamlessly fit into the rhythms of her small beach town both thrilled and terrified her. "Mrs. Henderson," he called out to an elderly woman walking her dog, a graying poodle mix that wagged its tail at the sight of Chase. "Did Tommy end up getting that on his math test?" The woman beamed, her weathered face lighting up. "He did. Thanks to those study tips you gave him at the youth football clinic. He hasn't stopped talking about how a real NFL player helped him understand fractions." Lila felt something warm settle in her chest as she watched Chase chat with Mrs. Henderson, asking about her daughter's new job in Seattle, and promising to bring Tommy some signed gear. This wasn't the polished, media-trained superstar quarterback. This was just Chase, genuinely invested in the lives of people around him, remembering details that most would forget. She found herself stealing glances at him between setting up the judge's station, wondering how someone who lived such a larger-than-life existence could seem so perfectly at home in her quiet corner of the world. The competition was in full swing when Drew stopped by, his presence making Lila tense automatically. The familiar, protective big brother energy radiated off him, but instead of his usual hovering, he simply nodded at Chase and asked if they needed any help. It was such an unexpected departure from his typical interrogation routine that Lila almost dropped the clipboard she was holding. "Actually," Chase said, flashing that disarming smile of his that never failed to make Lila's stomach do a little flip, "we could use another judge for the junior division. You surf, right?" Drew's eyebrows shot up, but a small smile played at his lips. The expression reminded Lila of when they were kids, that same look he'd get right before agreeing to one of her crazy schemes. "Yeah, I surf. Been catching waves here longer than you've been throwing footballs. You sure you want my help? Who better to judge than someone who'll be brutally honest? Besides, these kids deserve the best." The tension broke as Drew laughed, deep and genuine, and Lila felt something shift in the dynamic between the three of them, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. A warmth spread through her chest as she watched them throughout the afternoon. Later, as she observed them collaborating on scoring sheets, heads bent together in serious discussion over wave technique and form, she realized Drew had finally started to let go of his protective big brother stance. The thought made her both relieved and a little misty-eyed. During a break between heats, while the younger surfers were waxing their boards and checking conditions, Chase disappeared briefly, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper slightly worn at the edges. His eyes sparkled with anticipation as he held it out to her. "What's this?" Lila asked, taking the surprisingly heavy gift, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the paper. The afternoon sun caught in his hair, making the brown strands glint almost gold. "Open it." Inside was a beautiful brass compass, obviously antique, with intricate wave patterns etched into the case. The metal was warm to her touch, polished to a soft gleam that spoke of years of careful handling and love. When she opened it, her fingers trembling slightly, she found an inscription inside that made her breath catch, "For the girl who always finds her way back to the water." The words made her heart skip, and she traced them gently with her thumb, fighting back the sudden sting of tears. "I noticed your collection of nautical antiques in your office," Chase explained, rubbing the back of his neck, a rare show of nervousness that made him seem more endearing than ever. "And you mentioned how your dad used to collect compasses, how it was your special thing with him. I saw this one at that little antique shop off the promenade, and just knew it belonged with you. The moment I spotted it in the window display, I couldn't walk away." Lila's throat tightened, as memories of treasure hunting with her father at antique stores flooded back. Saturdays spent digging through dusty shelves, his excited whisper when he found something special, the way his eyes would light up when she spotted a hidden gem. She'd mentioned that exactly once, in passing, during a late-night conversation about their families. The fact that he'd not only remembered, but found something so perfect. "Chase, she was interrupted by shouts from the beach. A small group of paparazzi had arrived, cameras already clicking, their presence an unwelcome intrusion into this perfect moment. The familiar anxiety crept up her spine, as lens after lens turned their way. But before she could panic, Chase simply squeezed her hand, his touch steady and grounding. "Hey, look at me," he said softly, his green eyes holding hers. "They don't matter. This," he gestured between them, "this is what matters." His thumb brushed soothingly across her knuckles, and she felt her racing pulse begin to slow. His calm confidence settled over her like a warm blanket, steadying her racing thoughts. They handled the photographers together, working as a seamless team. Chase politely but firmly asking them to respect the competition while flashing that disarming smile of his, while Lila coordinated with local police to ensure they stayed behind designated barriers. She couldn't help but admire how naturally he took control of the situation without making a scene, how he managed to be both firm and charming at once. That evening, after the competition wrapped up and the crowds dispersed, they walked along the shoreline, their fingers loosely intertwined. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, casting long shadows across the sand, and the steady rhythm of waves created a peaceful backdrop. The salty breeze tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of ocean and summer, and she found herself leaning slightly into his warmth. The compass sat safely in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of how unexpectedly perfect this complicated man could be. "I'm scared," Lila admitted finally, stopping to face him. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she forced the words out. "Not of the cameras or the attention, but of this. Of us. Of letting myself believe this could work." The vulnerability in her own voice surprised her. Chase stepped closer, his green eyes serious, intense in a way that made her breath catch. "I know. And I get it. But Lila, I'm not going anywhere. Fame, football, none of that matters compared to what I feel when I'm with you." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "How can you be so sure?" She hated how small her voice sounded, how much she wanted to believe him. "Because for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm playing a role. With you, I'm just me. And that's enough." His words wrapped around her heart like a caress. The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. When he leaned down, his hand gently cupping her face, fingers threading through her windswept hair, she met him halfway. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deepening as she wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. He tasted like salt air and possibility, and for the first time, Lila let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. That what they had wasn't just some fleeting moment, bound to disappear with the tide. The sound of someone clearing their throat interrupted them. Drew stood a few feet away, looking simultaneously amused and uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in that way he'd done since they were kids. His eyes crinkled at the corners, despite his obvious attempt to maintain a stern expression. "Just wanted to let you know we finished loading all the equipment," he said, then fixed Chase with a steady look that Lila recognized as pure Big Brother protectiveness. His shoulders squared as he added, "Take care of her, Dalton." "I mean it." Chase nodded solemnly. "I will?" The conviction in his voice made her chest tight with emotion, and Lila found herself fighting back tears she hadn't expected. As Drew walked away, his flip-flops scuffing against the weathered boardwalk, Lila buried her face in Chase's chest, breathing in his familiar scent, a mix of cedar and ocean air, as she laughed softly. "Well, I guess that's as close to a blessing as we're going to get from my overprotective big brother." Her fingers curled into the soft fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment. Chase's arms tightened around her, solid and secure, his warmth seeping through her windbreaker. "I'll take it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she melted further into his embrace, savoring the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. The waves crashed softly behind them as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the compass a solid weight in Lila's pocket, reminding her that sometimes the scariest journeys led to the best destinations. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold, as if nature itself was celebrating their moment of perfect understanding. Chapter 9: A Grand Gesture. Chase stood in the Sharks' locker room, his heart racing faster than it ever had before a game. The team's annual Fan Appreciation Day was about to begin, but he had something bigger planned than the usual autograph sessions and photo opportunities. He adjusted his jersey for the 100th time, smoothing out invisible wrinkles as he mentally rehearsed his speech. His hands were surprisingly steady, despite the nerves coursing through him. A stark contrast to the butterflies in his stomach that reminded him of his first NFL start. The weight of the small velvet box in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. "You're going to wear a hole in that jersey," Drew said, leaning against the doorframe with an amused expression. "Relax. It's just a fan event." The easy confidence in his former rival's voice helped ground Chase, even if he couldn't fully embrace the casual attitude. After months of proving himself to Drew, their newfound friendship still felt like a minor miracle. "It's more than that," Chase replied, meeting Drew's gaze in the mirror. His fingers traced the Sharks logo on his chest, remembering how foreign it had felt at first compared to his old pro jersey. Now it felt like home. "This is about showing everyone, especially Lila, that I'm here for the long haul. That this isn't just another pit stop. That Oceanview is where I belong." Drew nodded, his usual protective skepticism softening into something that looked almost like approval. "She already knows that, man. But I get it. Sometimes you need the grand gesture." Coming from Drew, who'd initially been his toughest critic, the words carried extra weight. Chase couldn't help but remember their first heated confrontation when he'd joined the Sharks, how far they'd come since then. The stadium buzzed with excitement as Chase made his way onto the field, the familiar scent of freshly cut grass and sea air filling his lungs. Fans filled the stands, many wearing his number despite his relatively short time with the team. Kids pressed against the railings, waving programs and footballs, their eyes shining with the same pure love of the game he'd rediscovered here. The sight touched something deep in his chest. This wasn't the manufactured adoration he'd known in the pros. This was real. He spotted Lila near the sidelines, looking beautiful in a Sharks jersey that he recognized as his own, her hair catching the sunlight in a way that made his breath catch. She smiled at him, that same smile that had first made him realize fame and fortune meant nothing without someone real to share it with. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, "please welcome your Oceanview Sharks." Chase took the microphone, his practiced smile falling away to reveal something more genuine as he looked out at the crowd. His fingers tightened around the mic, as memories of press conferences and media days flashed through his mind, but this felt different. The air was charged with an energy he'd forgotten existed, pure and untainted by corporate sponsorships or million-dollar contracts. "Before we start today's festivities, I'd like to take a moment to thank this incredible community." He paused, finding Lila's eyes in the crowd, drawing strength from the warmth he saw there. Her presence steadied him, just as it had since that first day in her shop. "When I first came to Oceanview, I was running from something. From the pressure, the spotlight, the endless scrutiny. What I found here was so much more than just a hiding place. It became home." The crowd hushed, hanging on his words. Even the ever-present click of cameras seemed to fade away, replaced by an anticipatory silence that felt more intimate than any stadium this size had a right to be. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field, turning everything golden. "I found a real team, not just on the field but throughout this entire town. And I found something I wasn't even looking for, thanks to a certain surf shop owner who wasn't impressed by my quarterback stats." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd as Lila's cheeks flushed pink. Chase's heart swelled at the sight of her embarrassment. It was one of the things he loved most about her, how genuine every reaction was. She'd never learned to hide behind the polished veneer he'd worn for so many years. Chase gestured to the large screen behind him, which flickered to life with images of Salty Waves Surf Co. The familiar storefront brought back memories of their first meeting, when she'd practically thrown him out for disrupting her inventory count. He could still remember the fierce look in her eyes, the way she'd planted her hands on her hips, and told him being a pro quarterback didn't exempt him from common courtesy. "Today, I'm proud to announce that the Sharks are partnering with Salty Waves to create a youth surfing program for local kids. Every kid deserves a chance to catch their perfect wave, just like every player deserves a chance to throw their perfect pass." The announcement drew cheers, and Chase caught Drew's approving nod from the sidelines. The coach's acceptance meant more than he'd expected, especially after their rocky start. The memory of Drew's initial skepticism, made this moment even sweeter. But he wasn't finished. Lila Carson showed me what it means to be part of something real, he continued, his voice softening as memories washed over him. Sunset walks on the beach, early morning surf lessons, quiet moments in her shop when the world seemed to fade away. The way she'd challenged him, pushed him to be better, to be real. She taught me that sometimes the best plays aren't the ones you plan, they're the ones that happen when you're brave enough to trust your heart. Movement at the back of the crowd caught his attention, making his stomach clench with familiar dread. The mystery woman who'd caused so much trouble was pushing her way forward, her designer heels clicking against the concrete as she shoved past fans. Her familiar, determined expression, complete with that predatory smile he'd grown to hate, was clearly intent on creating another scene. Before Chase could react, Drew was already moving with the fluid grace of a former player, intercepting her with security in tow. The sight of Drew defending him, protecting this moment when months ago he would have been the first to doubt Chase's sincerity, confirmed how far they'd come. Chase kept his focus on Lila, refusing to let anyone derail this moment. His heart thundered in his chest the same way it did before a championship game, as he continued, "So today, I'm not just thanking our fans. I'm thanking the woman who reminded me why I fell in love with this game in the first place. Because at its heart, it's about community, about trust, and about finding your team. About finding the people who make you want to be better, who challenge you to grow." He walked across the field to where Lila stood, her eyes shining with unshed tears that caught the afternoon sunlight. Behind them, security was quietly escorting the mystery woman out, her protests fading into the distance, but neither Chase nor Lila noticed. The crowd's excited murmurs faded to background noise as he took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how right this felt after all the chaos and doubt. "I know you're still scared," he said softly, just for her ears, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her nervousness. "And that's okay. I'm not going anywhere. Whether it takes days or years, I'll be right here, proving every day that what we have is real. That this isn't just another headline or passing moment." Lila squeezed his hands, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying that hint of coastal breeze that had first captured his attention. "I think I'm ready to stop being scared." "Yeah." Chase's heart leapt, but he kept his voice steady, not wanting to pressure her. The last thing he wanted was to rush this moment they'd fought so hard to reach, this precious space between uncertainty and promise. "No pressure. We can take it as slow as you need." "Chase," she said, a smile tugging at her lips, that familiar spark of mischief dancing in her eyes that made him fall for her all over again, "shut up and kiss me." He didn't need to be told twice. As their lips met, the crowd erupted in cheers, but Chase barely heard them. All he could focus on was the feel of Lila in his arms, the way she melted into him like she belonged there. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd finally found his home. When they finally pulled apart, Drew was standing nearby, shaking his head but smiling. His usual protective big brother stance had softened into something warmer, more accepting. "Well," he said, clapping Chase on the shoulder with enough force to make him sway, "I guess I can't argue with that. Welcome to the family, quarterback." The rest of the event passed in a blur of autographs, photos, and congratulations. Oceanview residents approached Chase not as a celebrity, but as one of their own, sharing stories and expressing their support. Some talked about games they'd watched him play, others about how they'd seen him helping out at local events. Each interaction reinforced what he'd known for weeks now: he'd found his home, a place where he could just be himself. As the crowd began to thin, Chase found Lila sitting on the bleachers, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The sea breeze tousled her hair, and his heart skipped at how natural, how right it felt when he settled beside her, their shoulders touching. "So," he said, studying her profile in the fading light, "was that too much? I know you're not big on public displays." He couldn't help but worry. The last thing he wanted was to overwhelm her when they'd fought so hard to get here. Lila leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, the familiar scent of her coconut shampoo washing over him. It was perfect. Though I have to admit, seeing Drew tackle that woman was a highlight. Chase laughed, remembering how his former teammate had sprung into action. "Your brother's got good timing, I'll give him that." The look on her face when he intercepted her dramatic entrance was priceless. "He likes you now, you know," Lila said, intertwining her fingers with his. "He told me earlier that you've proved yourself 10 times over." "High praise from Lila Carson," Chase mused, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her closer. The metal bleacher was cold and uncomfortable, but he wouldn't have moved for anything. "Almost as good as hearing you say you're ready to take a chance on us." Lila turned to face him, her eyes serious despite her smile, the last rays of sunlight making them sparkle like the ocean. "I think I've been ready for a while. I was just waiting for my head to catch up with my heart." "Well," Chase said, pulling her closer and marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, "I'm glad they're finally in sync. Because I have big plans for us, Lila Carson." And for the first time in his life, those plans had nothing to do with football or fame. They were about building something real, something lasting, right here in Oceanview. Chapter 10, A Team Effort. The roar of the crowd pulsed through Lila's body as she stood on the sidelines, her fingers twisted in the hem of her Sharks jersey, Chase's number emblazoned across her back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field, and the salt-tinged breeze carried the familiar scents of grass, sweat, and anticipation. She breathed it all in, letting the electricity of game day wash over her like the waves she loved so much. Chase moved through his warm-up routine with fluid grace, his shoulders set with determination. Even from this distance, Lila could see the intensity in his eyes, the way he commanded attention without trying. Her heart did that familiar flip it always did when she watched him, pride and affection tangling together in her chest. It still amazed her sometimes, how naturally he'd fit into her life, despite all the chaos that had come with him. "He's got this," Drew's voice came from beside her, startling her from her thoughts. Her brother's presence was steady, calming, so different from the protective hovering of a few months ago. "You know, I was wrong about him." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with months of tension and gradual acceptance. Lila turned, studying Drew's profile. That must have hurt to admit. She could see the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the same expression he'd worn when they were kids and he'd been caught in a lie. He chuckled, bumping her shoulder with his. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it." His expression softened as he watched Chase direct the offense through their final warm-up plays. "But seriously, Lee, you've always known your own mind, even when I tried to protect you from everything. Maybe especially then." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tight. "You mean like when I was 16 and you threatened to drown my first boyfriend?" Lila grinned, remembering Drew's overprotective antics. The memory of that gangly teenager, running from her brother, still made her laugh. "He was a punk who didn't deserve you." Drew's laugh faded into something more serious. "But Chase, he's different. The way he looks at you," he shook his head. "It's like you're the only person in the stadium." His words echoed what she felt every time Chase's eyes found hers across a crowded room. Warmth bloomed in Lila's chest, but before she could respond, the whistle blew. The game was starting. The familiar surge of game day adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her nerves crackled as the teams took their positions. Chase looked impossibly tall under the stadium lights, his presence commanding even from yards away. The first quarter moved in a blur of motion and sound, each play sending Lila's heart into her throat. She found herself holding her breath with every snap, every throw, her body tensing and relaxing in rhythm with the game. When the opposing team scored first, putting the Sharks down by 7, Lila's fingers dug into her palms until her knuckles went white. But Chase remained steady, gathering his teammates around him during the timeout. Even from the sidelines, she could see his natural leadership at work, the way the other players leaned in, drawing strength from his confidence. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without demanding it. "Look at that," Drew murmured, his coaching instincts clearly engaged. He crossed his arms, a habit from their childhood that meant he was deeply focused. He's not just telling them what to do. He's making them believe they can do it. The game shifted after that. The Sharks' offense found their rhythm, and Chase's passes flew true and strong, cutting through the evening air with deadly precision. When they finally tied the score in the fourth quarter, Lila screamed herself hoarse along with the rest of the crowd, her heart thundering against her ribs with each successful play. During the next timeout, Chase turned toward the sidelines, his eyes finding hers unerringly through the chaos of players and coaches. The connection zinged through her body like electricity, making her breath catch. He gave her that small, private smile, the one that made her feel like they were the only two people in the world, before turning back to the huddle. Her skin tingled where his gaze had touched her. "Good Lord," Drew groaned beside her, rolling his eyes dramatically. "You two are disgustingly cute." Lila elbowed him hard in the ribs, but couldn't stop grinning. "Shut up and watch the game." The final minutes ticked down with excruciating slowness. The teams traded possessions, neither able to break the tie, each play ratcheting up the tension until Lila could barely breathe. With 30 seconds left, the Sharks had the ball on their own 40-yard line, and the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath. Chase took the snap, dancing away from pressure with the grace of a natural athlete. Time seemed to slow as he dropped back, his eyes scanning downfield with laser focus. The defensive line broke through, but Chase spun away, somehow maintaining his balance despite the chaos around him. He launched the ball just as a defender crashed into him, the impact making Lila's heart stop. The spiral hung in the air forever, a perfect arc against the stadium lights. Blaze stretched out impossibly long, his fingers just grazing the ball as he crossed into the end zone. His body was horizontal to the ground, defying gravity for that split second before he crashed down, the ball secured tight against his chest. The stadium erupted in a deafening roar that Lila could feel vibrating through her bones. Lila was moving before she realized it, her feet carrying her onto the field as the crowd surged around her. Her heart thundered in her chest, and all she could think about was finding Chase, telling him everything she'd been too scared to say before. All those nights lying awake, wrestling with her feelings, seemed ridiculous now in the face of such pure joy. Bodies pressed in from all sides, players, fans, media, all celebrating the Sharks' victory. The air was thick with the scent of grass and sweat and victory. Lila pushed through the chaos, searching for that familiar silhouette. She caught glimpses of navy jerseys, flashes of silver helmets, but Chase remained elusive in the sea of celebration. Her pulse quickened with every false sighting. Someone grabbed her elbow, and she turned to find Drew grinning at her, his face flushed with excitement and pride. "He's by the 20-yard line," he shouted over the noise, jerking his thumb toward the far end of the field. "Go get your quarterback, sis." The acceptance in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. Lila squeezed his arm in thanks and took off running, her heart racing faster with each step. The crowd was a blur of motion and sound around her, but her focus remained fixed ahead, where Chase stood surrounded by teammates, his helmet off and his hair damp with sweat. Even from this distance, she could see the pure elation radiating from him, the way his shoulders carried none of the weight they'd held all season. As if sensing her presence, he turned, and their eyes met across the yards between them. His face broke into that brilliant, heart-stopping smile that never failed to make her knees weak, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and showed the slight chip in his front tooth. Suddenly, Lila couldn't wait another second. Everything she'd been holding back came rushing forward like a wave she couldn't control. Chase stood behind the center, his heart pounding in rhythm with the crowd's deafening roar. 10 seconds left on the clock, down by 4. This was the kind of moment he'd lived for his entire career, the pressure that had defined him since his first game in the pros. But something felt different tonight. This wasn't about proving himself to the world anymore, wasn't about the headlines or SportsCenter highlights. It was about proving something to himself, to this town that had given him a second chance, and most importantly, to the woman watching from the sidelines with those ocean blue eyes that saw right through his carefully constructed walls. He allowed himself a quick glance toward where Lila stood, her blonde hair catching the stadium lights. Even from this distance, her smile cut through the chaos, steady and bright as a lighthouse beacon, reminding him of quiet moments at her shop and sunset walks along the beach. The tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. Win or lose, she'd changed everything for him, shown him what it meant to be more than just a star quarterback. Blue 42. Blue 42. Hut. The ball snapped into his hands with that familiar worn leather feel, and time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to this single moment. Chase dropped back, his cleats finding purchase in the well-worn turf, muscle memory taking over. The defensive line crashed through like a tidal wave, but his offensive line held, barely. He had 3 seconds tops before it all collapsed. Tank was covered, 2 linebackers shadowing his every move. Blaze was double-teamed on the left, his usual blazing speed contained by the defense. But there, cutting across the middle with perfect timing, was Marcus, their rookie receiver who'd been working his ass off all season, staying late after practice, studying film until his eyes were red. The kid deserved this moment, deserved to be more than just another backup player. Chase planted his back foot, feeling the torque build through his core as he let the ball fly. The spiral was perfect, exactly like they'd practiced 1,000 times, threading between 2 defenders like it was guided by GPS. Marcus stretched out, fingers extended, and time snapped back to full speed as the ball hit his hands with a satisfying thwack. "Come on, kid," Chase muttered, watching Marcus tuck the ball and sprint toward the end zone, carrying the hopes of the entire stadium with him. The stadium held its breath. 20 yards. 10 yards. 5. Chase's pulse thundered in his ears, matching the pounding footsteps of Marcus sprinting toward glory. Touchdown. The roar that erupted was deafening, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the field. Chase threw his arms up, yelling until his throat was raw as his teammates crashed into him from all sides, a mass of Navy jerseys and pure elation. Tank lifted him clean off the ground, spinning him like he weighed nothing. His massive linebacker's arms locked in a bear hug that squeezed the air from Chase's lungs. "That's how you do it, baby," Tank bellowed, his deep voice carrying over the chaos. "That's our QB." But Chase was already scanning the crowd flooding onto the field, looking for one face in particular. His eyes darted through the sea of celebrating fans and players, searching with an urgency that surprised even him. The mass of navy and silver parted like magic, and there she was, Lila Carson, running toward him with her blonde hair flying and her eyes sparkling with tears, her whole face lit up with a joy that made his chest ache. His heart did a funny little flip in his chest, the kind of sensation he hadn't felt since his first high school game. He'd thrown game-winning touchdowns in professional stadiums twice the size of this one, heard the roar of 70,000 fans, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever felt as important as this moment, watching Lila run toward him across the grass of their small-town field. "Chase." She launched herself at him, and he caught her easily, spinning them both around as her arms locked around his neck. The familiar scent of salt air and sunshine enveloped him as he held her close, and he buried his face in her hair, not caring who was watching or what headlines might appear tomorrow. This moment was worth any price. "You were amazing," she said, pulling back just enough to look at him. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes bright with emotion, and a few strands of blonde hair had escaped her ponytail to dance around her face. "I'm so proud of you." "Yeah." He couldn't help the grin spreading across his face, couldn't contain the joy bubbling up in his chest. After months of proving himself, of fighting against his reputation and the skeptics, her pride meant everything. "Proud enough to finally admit you're falling for me?" Lila laughed, but there was a vulnerability in her expression that made his breath catch. Her fingers played nervously with the collar of his jersey as she spoke. "I think I fell a while ago. I was just too scared to admit it." She bit her lip, then continued in a rush, "But I'm not scared anymore. I trust you, Chase. I want this, us, whatever comes next." Chase's heart soared. He'd been waiting to hear those words, dreaming about this moment through countless sleepless nights, but the reality was so much better than anything he'd imagined. The roar of the crowd faded away, until all he could hear was the sound of his own pulse racing. "Lila Carson," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I promise you won't regret this. I'm going to spend every day proving that your trust in me is worth it." "Well, that's good to hear," came Drew's voice from behind them, "because if you break her heart, I'll have to break your throwing arm." Chase turned, keeping one arm around Lila's waist, to find Drew watching them with an expression that was equal parts amusement and lingering big brother protectiveness. Even covered in grass stains and sweat from the game, Drew managed to look intimidating, though Chase noticed the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Drew, Lila warned, but she was smiling, leaning into Chase's side as if she belonged there. Drew held out his hand to Chase. Hell of a game, Dalton. Think you might have earned your place here, both on the field and off it. The words carried the weight of acceptance Chase had been working toward since the day he'd arrived in Oceanview, and he felt the last piece of his new life falling perfectly into place. Chase shook his hand firmly, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. After months of proving himself both on and off the field, Drew's acceptance felt like the final victory of the night. Thanks, Coach. That means a lot. Just remember what I said about that throwing arm, Drew added with a wink, his earlier intensity softening into something more brotherly. Lila groaned beside them, her fingers lightly squeezing Chase's arm. Seriously? You're still going with the overprotective brother routine? Always, Drew said cheerfully, his grin widening. Someone's got to keep this hotshot quarterback in line. He clapped Chase on the shoulder with enough force to make him sway. Speaking of which, your adoring public awaits. Try not to let it go to your head. Chase laughed, finally noticing the reporters gathering at the edge of the field, their cameras already flashing like fireflies in the growing dusk. A few months ago, he would have dreaded their presence, would have felt that familiar tightness in his chest at the thought of another round of invasive questions. Now, with Lila warm against his side and the taste of victory sweet on his tongue, he found he didn't mind at all. Let them wait, he said, turning back to Lila. Her eyes were soft and full of promise as she looked up at him, strands of blonde hair escaping her ponytail to dance in the evening breeze. I've got something more important right here. Smooth talker, she teased, but her smile was radiant, lighting up her entire face in a way that made his heart skip. You love it, he countered, pulling her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of coconut sunscreen that always clung to her skin. Maybe I do. She stretched up on her tiptoes, pressing a kiss to his cheek that left a trail of warmth in its wake. But don't let it go to your head. Chase laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. The stadium lights blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the field as his teammates celebrated around them, and somewhere in the distance, reporters were probably spinning this into tomorrow's headlines. But none of that mattered. Here in this moment, with Lila in his arms and the whole town cheering, Chase finally felt like he'd found his way home. The spotlight that had once felt like a prison now felt more like a spotlight on everything he'd gained. A team that had his back, a town that had welcomed him, and most importantly, a woman who saw past the headlines to the man he truly was. Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review on Amazon.